Question number 3. My father is quite clearly an Aspie, though he's never been formally diagnosed. This has clearly impacted on my mother as well as my brother and I wonder how much of Asperger's responses are learned and copied by the children of an Asperger's parent. As children learn by example, is it possible they may exhibit some behaviors via osmosis and example rather than being Asperger's themselves? This is from Al.
Oh, yes, Al, you're spot on there. Asperger's syndrome is infectious. The more you live with or work with Aspie people, the more Aspie you become. And so, to a certain extent within the family, it's a survival mechanism of the neurotypicals, because quite often the Asperger characteristics, especially in a father, can be the dominant force in the family. And sometimes you have to fall into line and you have to adopt the same pattern of less social life, rigid routines, all those sorts of things to survive. Now, what we find is, though, that when the children go and visit other families with their friends, they say, wow, this family is totally different. There's a very different atmosphere. There's a very different routine. I feel quite comfortable here. And that's something that I did in my childhood because I would visit other families. My mother would say, Anthony, you're where you're welcome at. And I said, no, because I want to be in a normal family. So in some ways, I think what you have is someone who can be different and true to their neurotypical self at school and at other people's homes. But when they go into the Aspie household, they almost put the Aspie mask on to succeed in that environment. So we talk about those with Asperger's faking it in a way and putting on a mask. Then the children in that environment may also do the same to be able to create an atmosphere of home, of cohesion that is accommodating the Aspie characteristics. So very interesting question.
Yeah. The next is from Inkspot. She says, my sister was seen recently by an infectious disease specialist for an infection that she had acquired in the hospital. The doctor has been unable to explain why my sister is so prone to infections while in the hospital. He pulled me out of the room and stated that autism and Munchhausen Syndrome go hand in hand. He then went back in the room and confronted my sister with his theory. It was a terrible situation. Is there a link between ASD and Munchausen Syndrome? Also, how can one defend themselves against an argument that basically is a he said, she said situation?
Okay, first of all, Munchausen syndrome is where the person pretends to be ill for a variety of reasons. It's a fake. Now, of course, often in medical examinations, as we have with the TV series House, etc., the actual diagnosis may appear elusive, and there can be a temptation to assume that it's fabricated, that it's false, the person is making it up, because scientifically we haven't found the cause. But it's then a terrible accusation to say that someone who is ill is faking it. So I'm very concerned that this would occur. Now, there's no link between autism and Munchausen syndrome. So sometimes I think when the person can't find a medical reason, they look for a psychological reason, and this may be looked at. Now, I'm going to go through this in a bit more depth. First of all, the person with Asperger's syndrome can have a different sensory system that includes the perception of pain. And so pain is a medical way of reporting where the problem is and the nature of the pain. So the person may not be able to give pain information accurately. Secondly, the ability to describe yourself, your feeling, and often in Asperger's there's a mind-body division, and the person is often not in touch with their body. And so they're not very good at reporting the symptoms, which confuses medical people. We also know that those with Asperger's are going to be incredibly stressed. And so you're going to get stress-related disorders. And also, we do know that Asperger's and autism is also associated with autoimmune disorders. So those need to be looked at too. So I think there's a sort of a problem in that situation of jumping to conclusions, it must be pretend, when in fact I think it needed further investigation to find out what's going on. But I do know many with Asperger's in general hospitals find communicating the nature of ASD very difficult to medical staff, and you do need to explain that I have a different perception of pain. I sometimes have difficulty reporting and knowing the words to describe my feelings in my body, but I am under extreme stress and I need to be assessed in a way that is working with me rather than being accusatory.
Mm-hmm. It was such an unfortunate thing.
Mm.
The next question is from NT Jane. She said, my boyfriend of many years was recently diagnosed with Aspergers, and he just lost his mother. He broke up with me days after the funeral, and he took off traveling, and he doesn't want to hear from me. He's convinced he's acting on what he needs to do because he's learned now that life is short. Is there any way to help him realize that his grieving and running away won't fix the hurt? That's a great question.
Okay, first of all, NT Jane, that tells me a lot about how you cope with grief. Mm-hmm. And that is to share the feeling, to use affection, support, and talking as your way of cleansing the system and overcoming that sense of grief. It's an interpersonal way. So for neurotypicals, that's the usual way we share it, we cry together. Now, in Asperger's, the way of alleviating distress and confusion and all the changes and so on that are going to occur is something you do internally and you do in a solitude strategy rather than an interpersonal one. So it's quite likely that he's left, not necessarily as a rejection of NT Jane, but really to sort himself out, which he does on his own. Mm-hmm. It's solitude is your emotional restorative. But the trouble is this can take a lot of time. Usually when you do it in an interpersonal sense, it's a very quick process. So by being alone, he's adjusting to the new situation, overcoming his sense of grief. And I do know those with Asperger's tend to grieve in a very different way to neurotypicals, which again leads to accusations of, what are you doing? You don't care, all those sorts of things. When I think he may be sorting himself out, going out beyond the usual circle of contacts to sort himself out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He needs time alone.
From his perspective.
Mm-hmm.